Welcome to the MyCP webinar series. My name is Paul Gross. I'll be your host, and we are very fortunate to have Dr. Garey Noritz here, who's going to give us an update on our Cerebral Palsy registry. As usual, I'm going to start with a quick overview about the CP Research Network for those of you that are joining afresh. For those of you who have been to a year or more of our webinars, this is coffee break time. And then I'll turn it over to Dr. Noritz, and then we'll have ample time for questions and answers. Okay, so using the old names of CPRN and CP NOW, the two organizations that came together, we were founded both out of the same meeting. There was an NIH workshop in September of 2014, and out of that workshop came a push to do 5 things. One was to start a national CP registry. The second was to do more research comparing interventions. A third was to have more study of adults with CP. A fourth was to grow the field, make sure we had more clinician scientists coming into the field to replace the older generation of researchers that would be leaving the field. And then lastly, to advance basic and translational science for cerebral palsy. The CPRN was born out of that effort. I led an effort with Deb Gabler to start a national CP registry. I met Dr. Noritz at that meeting. We all ended up coming together and deciding to form the Cerebral Palsy Research Network to tackle what became all 5 of these objectives coming out of the meeting. Michelle Schusterman was also at that meeting, and she took away a different need, which was the need for real evidence-based information for people who got a diagnosis of CP. And so she formed a 501c3 called CP NOW in 2015, coming out of that meeting, and really sought to improve the well-being of people with CP and their families and to fund important research. So in the beginning of 2021, we announced that these two organizations were coming together. We had 4 websites between the two of us, and we formed what we decided to name the Cerebral Palsy Research Network. Our mission, optimizing the lifelong health and wellness of people with cerebral palsy and their families through high quality research, education, and community programs such as our well-being programs. So just to share a couple key milestones for our combined entity in education, which is one of our key pillars. We launched a toolkit, the CP Toolkit, in 2015, and we've had more than 4,000 people receive either a printed or an online version of that toolkit since. It's distributed by many hospitals. We have released well-being guides a well-being guide in 2017, and then we translated the CP Toolkit into Spanish and then Portuguese. And then in 2020, we launched a MyCP to allow people to have personalized information. So take information about you and serve up information specifically that you need about cerebral palsy. In research, we launched our clinical registry in 2016, and you're going to hear a lot more about that tonight. And it's got more than 5,000 patients in it. Then we went on in 2017 to do a patient-centered research agenda, which was eventually published in 2018, to really drive where we would focus our energy in research. We went on to have significant public funding milestones for both the registry infrastructure and for a specific genetic study in 2018 and 2019. We currently have 4 quality improvement initiatives, which are another way to improve outcomes in addition to research. And we launched those across the network in 2020. And we've had 5 publications, over 20 academic presentations, and we have several manuscripts in the hopper for publication. In terms of wellness, we launched a virtual wellness program in June of 2021 called MyCP Fitness, that's implemented with our partner Staying Driven, which is a free wellness program. And we partnered with the National Center for Health, Physical Activity, and Disability to recruit people to their free mindfulness, exercise, and nutrition program known as Mentor. So those are key milestones in the network. So what is it? It's a 501c3. It's a group of institutions, the clinicians that treat people with CP in those institutions, the therapists, researchers, and patient advocates, which can be, people with CP or just members of the community, conducting research to improve outcomes for CP. We physically have a data coordinating center that's based at the University of Utah, and that hosts both a clinical registry, i.e. a database of information about people that come in and are seen by doctors, and a community registry, which is based on information that you fill in into a survey that's available on the web. And then we have these education and well-being programs. One of our biggest programs is this MyCP, this free personalized web resource that anybody can sign up for on CPRN.org. It allows you to participate in the community registry by participating in surveys and being notified of other studies. It provides for private discussions about research and research priorities and lived experience. Again, it personalizes web resources for you, recommends videos, books, and web pages based on information you give us about your cerebral palsy. And then it also gives you access to our free wellness programs. So anybody can sign up at mycp.org. So to give you an idea of what these registries hold, I'm going to give you one data point. So this is from the community registry. This is using the gross motor function classification system, which is a rating scale to describe how one moves through the community. Is it using a wheelchair? Is it walking independently, walking with a walker? And you can see the distribution of the roughly 1,000 people that we have across the GMFCS levels. And you can see there's 1,000 people with CP in the registry. By contrast, the gross motor function classification system score within the community registry this is from a data point prior to what Dr. Noritz is going to show you when we had 4,485 patients. But you see it's a very different distribution. And that distribution is reflective of the people that come into hospitals to be treated for their CP. So you can see that, and this is a little more reflective if you were to look at a population view of what that would look like. So those are our programs, a set of education programs, health and well-being, research and quality, and then we really focus a lot on engaging you in the community in research. We are physically located across the United States. The green pins are sites that are actively collecting data into the registry. Yellow are preparing some of the technology. Red are working on some of the compliance issues. And blue are candidate sites that have raised their hands and said they want to join the network. We live to accelerate research and improve outcomes. So this is our pipeline. On the left-hand side is a funnel of all of the studies that are in various stages of development. We take them through a process where they're reviewed as a concept. They proceed towards an application to get funding. If they get funded, they get institutional review board approval or the ethics approval to conduct the research. And then they get implemented, studied, written up, and then ideally published, and then having those findings roll back into how we do clinical care. So we're constantly improving outcomes. The blue circle, the blue ovals are research projects. The orange ovals are our QI projects. And if you look back at this over time, it just got filled more and more over time. And so that's why we exist, is to accelerate this research. So without further ado, I look forward to turning it over to Dr. Garey Noritz. He's a developmental pediatrician and an internist at Nationwide Children's Hospital. He's the director of their complex care program. He is a founding member of CPRN. Dr. Noritz and I sat down at lunch at that NIH meeting, and he explained about their single center registry. And that was the beginning of a long relationship that really was essential to leading to where we are today. He is the PI, or principal investigator, of the registry. And he also leads our quality improvement effort to improve care of adults. So with that, I will stop sharing my screen, give Dr. Noritz a chance to flip his screens around and take over.
Yeah, thanks, Paul. And thanks everybody for joining tonight. As always, it's going to take me just a little bit of time to figure out how to share. Again, we had it going, and now
And I
Bear,
took over and got in the way.
yeah. Bear with me, everybody. All right, let's see. Where are my tools? We really had this going before. Everybody should have been on it before we did that. Okay, share screen. All right, and
That looks good.
Right view. Okay.
Right view. Take it away.
Wonderful. Okay. Again, thanks everybody for joining. I'm Gary. I'm in Columbus, Ohio, and I'm glad to have a chance to tell you about the clinical registry, what it is, what it isn't, where we hope it will go, that kind of stuff. Kind of boring stuff. I don't have any disclosures relevant to this, and I'm not talking about any pharmaceutical products or any other equipment kind of stuff. So that's irrelevant as well. So we just heard this. I didn't realize Paul was going to give the overview. So this is what he just said. We're the CPRN. We're a bunch of people who care about people with CP and people with CP. And we want to improve the care that people receive. Data Coordinating Center in Utah. There's a clinical registry, which is what I'm talking about today, different from the community registry. So let me sort of pause there for a minute and just expand a little bit on what Paul said. So the registry or the clinical registry is essentially coming out of hospitals and doctors' offices. And so you have to sort of take everything that comes with that with a little bit of a grain of salt and a little bit of the perspective of, okay, the people that are in this registry and the data that's generated from the clinical registry is reflective of the people that are going to the hospitals that are members of CP Research Network. So that means that they are, going to one of, a number of tertiary or sort of magnet hospitals around the country, being seen in CP focused programs, which is not reflective of every single person with CP in the United States or Canada or any other place. And so that's one of the things to realize. And I think Paul showed it nicely when he showed that the people that we see in those clinics are different fundamentally from the people that are filling out the community registry. There's overlap, of course, but it's tough to draw it can be tough to draw conclusions because really neither of those are what we really wish we had in some ways, which is a population-based registry. So in other countries and regions, particularly Australia, the Nordic countries and Ontario, there's a population-based registry for people with CP that essentially captures data on every single person with CP in that province or area or whatever it is. And that's great. And whatever amount of information you can get from that really it can be expected to be reflective of, let's say, your average person with CP or the experience of the average person with CP in those areas. But the data they have is a bit limited because it's not linked to clinical data the way that we have things linked to clinical data. So that's the trade-off, is that we get deeper and richer information, but it is not a population-based sample. And so we need to be careful about the conclusions we draw from that. And that's among the other things that CPRN is, and Paul went over that as well. It serves the community, it serves the researchers, it serves people doing QI work, and it's really a pleasure to be a part of that organization. So where are we now? So at least the numbers that I was using, Paul, is that we have 33 centers to some extent with some level of participation, and 11 centers that are currently contributing data, at least a little bit of data, to our CPRN clinical registry. And with those 11 centers, we have somewhere a little bit more than 5,200 patients in the registry, which is really a lot. And so if you think about, how many people with CP are there in the province of Ontario or in the state, I think, of Queensland, which is the one in Australia that has the registry there. It's not 5,200 patients, and so again, not only do we have more deeper information, but we have more patients as well. So how does all this work? The experience of going to the doctor these days is like talking to somebody who is working a computer terminal, and I'm as guilty of this as any other doctor in that, at the same time I'm trying to take care of patients, I'm trying to enter information into the computer because that's the mechanism by which we take care of patients these days. So sort of where this came from was a realization on clinician, doctors, therapists, and so on, part that, we could make the electronic medical record or electronic health record work for us instead of us working for it. And so the way we did that was we sort of changed the way that we chart and capture data within the medical record so that it can serve a number of purposes, not just taking care of the patient that's in front of us, but also gathering information in a unified and streamlined way that can inform the care of all of the patients that we take care of. So when it's really working, the doctor, while they're taking care of the patient, is generating a clinical note, the things that are needed to take care of that patient, the history, the elements of the exam, the important things that they're going to do for the patient, the referrals they're going to make, the orders they're putting in, the medications we're prescribing, all of those things and so on. But at the same time, that's captured in such a way that it can be organized and pushed to the data center. So that's the best case scenario, is that sort of the doctor, clinician, whoever enters things once into the computer, and then it goes out to the various places that it needs to go to. Doesn't always work exactly that way, and it's different in different organizations as well. And so some of the organizations, to some extent, have a research assistant enter data separately to get pushed to the data repository, which is in Utah. Now, that data that goes out of the institution into Utah is de-identified, and so it can't be traced back to individual people without permission from the individual people to have their data traced back. And so we have some studies that we do need to have permission from the participants to be part of the study and to get the sort of identified data that predominantly that's our genetic study, where we need to have not just the clinical things that are going on with the patient, but also their genetic things. And so people do consent separately to have their data re-identified. But because it's a de-identified data set, our institutional review board, which is the part of our hospital that examines studies and makes sure that we're doing them ethically, approved us to do this study with a waiver of consent, because really what we're doing is providing clinical care to patients, and then the data is just being organized in a different way. And so it's all on the up and up, I think, is my message there. Okay, so what data do we have to share, and what do we have to show? So again, our total N, as it were, number of individual patients in the study is 5,203. And this is the range of age groups that they are. And so, what over on the left-hand bar graph. So what can we say from this? And so number one, there's a lot more kids in the study in the registry than adults. And that stands to reason because the patients are coming from children's hospitals. Not that children's hospitals don't see adults, but they're coming from children's hospitals. And obviously, there are many, at this point, probably more adults than CP, more adults with CP than children with CP, because adults with CP can live quite a long time. but it's a substantial number over the age of 18, as you can see, and it does drop off once you get past age 25. Now, within the registry, there's, I want to say, 6 sites that have a fair number of adults, have a separate adult clinic. And so there are adults getting care, but it's the number is just smaller than of all the children. Now, in terms of gestational age, which is a big, being premature, being a big risk factor for cerebral palsy, if you look at here on the right side, the majority of patients were full term, which is to say 37 weeks or more of gestation, 40 being your typical gestational age, but really quite a lot of the various stages of prematurity, extreme prematurity, very premature, and so on. So you might say, well, why is the N here only 2,500 when the total N is 5,200? It's about half. The reason for that is because of the way we collect the data as part of the registry. It's a clinical database in that we can only collect what the doctors and clinicians are entering into the database. And so if the doctor doesn't enter what the gestational age is into the specific part of the database that we are capturing, then we don't know what the gestational age was. And that's essentially a missing number. And so I'm sure all the doctors know the gestational age of all the patients, at least whether they were full term or premature or so on. But it has to do with the way that the data is collected. And that because of that, we have quite a bit of incomplete data, as you're going to see. But if you have an electronic medical record, then we know your birthday. And then, so, every single person in the registry, we know what their age is. And we know the gender of almost every single patient. The interesting thing here is, as we know, CP is more common in boys than girls. And so our data does sort of match up in that way. But if you add these numbers up, they don't add up to 5,203. And that's because there are now a number of transgendered patients or people that identify as transgender in the database. And so it's a pretty small number, but they're there as well. Race is an interesting thing to look at because we've always been taught, and the data bears out, that people that identify as Black have a higher incidence of cerebral palsy and a higher incidence of prematurity and so on. But as we've come to realize what is behind that, we no longer believe it's something innate about the biology of people who are Black, but it's part of the experience of being Black in America, shall we say, in terms of the various inequities that we know are out there. So these are self-reported racial categories. And the interesting thing here is that it's so predominantly a white sample. I think when you look at more population-based data, it really should not be taken to say that, the average, I don't know what it is here, 2/3 of patients with CP in the United States are white. This is a reflection of who's coming to the centers and being enrolled in the registry. Okay, we can sort of make guesses as to why makeup is the way that it is, but we don't know for sure. This is etiology or cause of CP, at least as best we can. The individual clinicians can adjudicate it. Again, we have not a little bit more than half of the sample reported on what they thought the etiology or cause of the CP is. The interesting thing here is that the number one cause was unknown. And this is not filled in. This is the clinician saying, I don't know why the patient in front of me has cerebral palsy. when you look at the ones that we think we know what there is, there's a good bit of hypoxic ischemic encephalopathy. There's prematurity related ventricular leukomalacia. There's congenital stroke in there. There's brain malformations, and just as time goes on, we're going to see more and more genetic conditions end up in this bucket here. But that number, it's about 1/5 of the patients. We don't know why they have CP, and that means that we have work to do to figure out why they have CP. So Paul mentioned at the outset the gross motor functional classification system. This is illustrated here on the bottom, just for people that aren't quite familiar with it. And it's a pretty easy thing to do, and people and parents and with CP are pretty good at saying, oh, that looks like what I can do or what my child can do, and can self-classify where the gross motor functional classification scale is. This is a we believe, somewhat typical distribution for the population, in that there's a good bit of very mild CP, there's a good bit of very severe CP, there's less in the middle, and you have this, what we would call a U-shaped curve because of that. And so it's interesting because who is coming to get care for CP? There's a lot of patients who are ambulatory, GMFCS1 or GMFCS2, ambulatory with a little bit of help, and they're trying to maintain their ambulation to a large extent. And then there are more severely affected patients who use wheelchairs or are pushed in wheelchairs, and their needs are often quite a bit different in terms of what they need from a CP program. So it's another sort of interesting thing when you look at individual CP programs. Do we have more level 1s on one side, or more level 2s on one side, and level 5s and so on? There's a similar scale called the Manual Ability Classification System, or the MACS, and this is the distribution there. Only 1,000 patients have had this administered to them, or at least had it captured within the medical record, so tough to draw conclusions. When we talk about CP, we also want to know, what is the distribution? Is this a person with unilateral, or what we used to call hemiplegic CP or monoplegic CP? Or is this a bilateral problem, indicating that there are bilateral problems with the brain? And you can sort of suss it out to say diplegia, is this primarily in the legs, or quadriplegia, are the arms and legs fairly equally affected? And then there's a bilateral asymmetric or triplegic way of thinking about CP. And often the care that's needed for somebody with unilateral versus bilateral CP can be quite different. In terms of tone or movement abnormality, by far the most common thing is spasticity. We have also a number of patients that are dystonic, and when you look at this quote, I don't think I can show you my cursor, but the mixed group, which is a third from the right, that's predominantly patients that are a mixture of spasticity and dystonia. And you remember from the beginning that one of the real things we want to do a better job with in taking care of people with CP is dystonia, which is a sort of a combination of a tone and movement disorder that can be really very disabling, can cause a lot of pain, and not that spasticity doesn't. But we have, to some extent, better treatments for spasticity than we do for dystonia. Seizures are common in patients with CP at a population level. We think it's about 40%. That's not too far off from what we have in our registry. There's a good bit of vision impairment. not as much hearing impairment as we might think, but so vision problems predominate over hearing problems. And then about half of the patients that have this data point captured use feeding tubes. And that definitely should not be taken as reflective of the population. But of the centers that capture this data point, they are undoubtedly seeing a more severe a group of patients than some other centers, because we know that half of patients, people with CP in the country, don't have a feeding tube. And this is who reported pain in the last 2 weeks. All right, so that's what's that, about a fifth or so reported pain in the last 2 weeks. This is all comers, and this is one of the things that it would be really great to break down a little bit down the road, is to say, well, we also are pretty sure that pain, older people tend to have more pain than younger people with CP. So really, what's the distribution when you account for age? I didn't pull that out for this presentation, but that is something that we can pull out, and we should be able to pull out without a whole lot of trouble. So it's a matter of deciding what questions we're going to ask the registry, because there's a lot of things in there, and we need to just figure out what are the appropriate questions to ask it. There's a good bit of surgical data and fairly specific surgical data that has been collected. Basically equal numbers of rhizotomies and backlift and pump insertions, and more than 1,000 lower extremity orthopedic procedures. And, again, not to be taken as this is the average experience or the typical experience for patients with CP, but of the people coming to these 11 plus centers, these are the procedures that they're getting. So what can we take away from this? Number one, every year, there's more and more data, there's more and more patients. The breadth of the data we collect increases, the depth of the data we collect increases. We have now longitudinal data. Sometimes, within our own institution, we have data going back 10 years. Within CPRN, it's a little bit closer to 5. But we are now really being able to see the trajectory of lots of people with CP with a pretty good amount of granularity related to their clinical characteristics. The accuracy of this data capture is really important. And so it's a garbage in, garbage out kind of thing, as we found, is if we're not being careful with our data entry, as we should be, because this is the data we're actually using to take care of people, the data won't be very good on the other end. And so there's a lot of data out there. In the data, I often have a medical student work with me over the summer looking at some small piece of the registry data, and that's been a good experience for them. And what I tell them is, we have all this data, come ask it a question, come figure out what's something interesting that we don't know about people with CP, and we'd like to know more. And so some of the projects we've looked at have to do with hip migration, have to do with likelihood of hip dislocation, have to do with drooling, have to do with prevalence of autism or depression among the patients with CP, and what are the characteristics of patients that do have autism versus don't have autism who also have CP. Not all reported certainly yet, but it's nice having the data, because now we have a place to go. And from this data, it's all retrospective, but we can collect things prospectively, and we can hang our various research projects off of this apparatus. And so that's what Michael Kruer, who's a neurogeneticist at Phoenix, was able to do, was to say, okay, we can recruit from the registry, from people that are enrolled in the registry. If they're willing, we can sequence their DNA, we can pull out their individual data from the registry and try to match up what their genetic code or genotype is versus what do they look like clinically, or what we call their phenotype. Some really interesting things are going to come out of that study that is already underway. And I bet a lot of the people on this call are participating in that study, and thank you for that. All right. Well, that is what I have to tell you about the registry for today. I'm happy to take questions. I'm going to stop sharing my screen so I can see all of you participants. And I appreciate the opportunity to talk to you today.
Oh, thanks, Dr. Noritz. We greatly appreciate it. I'd like to open the floor to questions. Lots of options here. You can raise your hand, you can speak up, but if you find you're colliding, back off and I'll call on one of you, or you can put a question in the chat. Any of those will work as a solution. And if I don't get a question quickly, I may kick off on one, but had a few.
So Maribel asks, is it too late to participate in the study? So I guess my question is, which study? The Michael Kruer genetics study, I believe, is still open and recruiting. And Paul, how can people find their way to that?
So the interesting thing about the recruitment for that study is it's center-based. And so if you go to the CPRN website and go to our genetics page, which is, you look under cerebral palsy research and look at genetics study, it'll list all the sites that are participating. If you're seen at one of those sites, you can participate, you can ask them and they'll send you a link. All of the consent is actually done online using a iConsent that we built, and it gives you a video that explains it, and we send you a spit kit. It needs to be the person with CP and both biological parents. So if a parent is deceased or if someone is adopted, that won't work. Because it's a trio study, we need to get all three. So basically, if you're seen at one of those centers, we ask you to contact the center to get the link to participate, because we can't collect data from people that aren't seen at CPRN centers because all the data is already in the registry that Dr. Kruer is linking to. So hope that helps. If you have a more specific question, you feel free to send me mail at paul@cprn.org. I'm glad to help out.
So then the second part of the question is, if the question is, how do I participate in the clinical registry? Well, you have to get care at one of the centers that's participating that's collecting data. But anybody who has CP can sign up to be in the community registry, right, Paul?
Yes, and in answer to the question by Chris Myers, so the community registry is intended for people to sort of self-select. And so if you go there, we ask you go through an onboarding survey, which asks you a few questions about you and your CP. The data is kept privately, but we do ask you things like your birth date. And then there's a set of surveys. And so if you're an adult, we actually have a survey you can take, it's optional, about your well-being and pain, and you can take that. And that helps us learn, what is the lived experience of a person that has mild CP versus a person that has more severe CP. So that's the way to sort of raise your hand. There's a set of, there's the onboarding survey gets you in, and then there are optional surveys after that you can take after you do a quick consent. Okay, other question.
Great. Wendy, do all the sites use the same ethic, like the Learn from Every Patient program that you guys started?
I'm sorry, you were breaking up for me. Garey, were you able to understand the question?
Just a little bit. So Wendy's my former partner from Nationwide. So she's talking a little bit about the original iteration of the CP Research Network was our single center study called Learn from Every Patient. And Wendy, if I think I heard your question correctly, you're asking, does everybody use the same forms that we use in Learn from Every Patient?
Yeah.
And the answer is kind of. we have a somewhat unified set of data collection forms. And then sites that use the Epic electronic health record, we're able to work with them to get those sites in front of the doctors and for utilization. And actually, Paul, I'm not sure where we stand with hospitals that use other electronic health record.
Yeah, I can summarize that. And Wendy, just so you know, I muted you because you were echoing. So when if you want to speak more, you'll need to unmute. Yeah, so right now, Gillette Children's Hospital is leading our effort to build a parallel set of forms in Cerner. If you were to look at a sort of pie chart of market share for electronic medical record systems, Epic would be the biggest, and then Cerner, and then something called Allscripts. So we have a few sites like Phoenix Children's built their own interface to be able to participate in this for their EMR. And then we have one that's being built for Cerner. And then a number of the sites that are Cerner are actually currently doing chart abstraction. So they're going to the medical record and filling in a set of parallel forms that are stored in REDCap. And so that's how sites that either don't have the Epic resources to get up and running or don't have Epic actually participate. And Seattle is one of our largest sites, and they've recently become an Epic site. They haven't launched their Epic forms, but they've entered over 1,000 patients into REDCap. Okay, Duncan, I see your hand is up.
Yes, Gary, your graphs indicated what I think many of us know, the disparity in age and race, ethnicity. As a clinician, how do you think we who are on tonight can help to maybe flatten those silos?
Oh, that is a great question that I'm not sure I have a good answer to.
Nor do I.
Yeah, I think a lot of what we're going to learn from adults is going to come from the community registry rather than the clinical registry, just because the amount of sort of organized care for adults with CP is still pretty limited compared to pediatric. As far as the sort of racial differences go, I think it's the larger problem of trying to build an equitable health system.
I
Go
think
ahead,
that
have a follow on. Go ahead, Duncan.
second to that is the transition from that adolescent, early adulthood population who tend to see pediatric specialists. What has been your experience at Nationwide? And I know you're very involved with the American Pediatrics Association in helping to transition those of us with CP from the pediatric care to adult care.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I think I bet everybody on the call knows how big of a problem that is. I will say there are pockets of a few centers which, try to run a adult CP program. We do, Michigan does, Columbia, New York. I don't want to leave anybody out on purpose, but I know that Gillette, I think, has a strong interest in that sort of transition kinds of place. Sorry?
UCSD.
Okay, yeah, thank you.
And UCLA.
Yeah. So it's funny, I was on a call yesterday with like the big people in transition with the American Academy of Pediatrics, because it's time to sort of rewrite the policy that the Academy has with it. it's evolved over time. I mean, the first sort of policies came out more than 10 years ago. A big thing, I could talk for hours about it, I think, but a couple things to say. One is that transition's a process. It can't be like, oh, you know, you turned 18, so like get out of here, like go find another doctor. You know, it's no secret that you're going to turn 18 on your 18th birthday, and we need to start planning for that. The academy, our academy, in combination with the American College of Physicians, which is the Internal Medicine Academy, and the American Academy of Family Physicians, says we really need to start discussing this at age 12. And there's a whole lot more to transition than who's your CP doctor going to be. That's a big part of it, I think, for people with CP. But it's, you know, who are all your doctors going to be? Where are you going to live? How, you know, what's your health insurance going to be? How do you learn? And this is for all adolescents. How do you learn to take care of yourselves and become an advocate for yourself in the healthcare system? The average adolescent who doesn't have a chronic illness doesn't know how to do that either. You know, that's one of those things that they need to, you know, sort of everybody needs to get ready for. So, but if you think ahead of time, who are your CP doctors going to be? And you can start working on that well before your 18th birthday, you're better off, I think, is the main thing. So just locally, and I think to a large extent, all of a lot of transition solutions are going to be local. We have a large children's hospital. We have 2 large adult hospital systems, both of which employ physical medicine doctors and orthopedists and neurologists, none of whom are real experts in CP. They know spasticity from taking care of patients with stroke and traumatic brain injury and multiple sclerosis. And they know wheelchairs, and they know bowel and bladder management and like these things. And so a large part of it is sort of left to us on the pediatric side to train people up, train adult providers up into using the knowledge that they have and the skills that they have in Botox and whatever else, and applying it to CP. I'm sure I've danced around your question more than I meant to, Duncan, but it's a long answer.
So, Dr. Noritz, Poonam had a question about the population and being surprised to see that there were so many non-preemies in the mix. Can you comment on that?
I think it is. I don't know what the sort of national data is in terms of people with CP are half full term or a third full term. And if someone on the call may know that, I think it's a peculiarity of who is seen at the centers.
Yes. And it's important to note that, like, at your center, you probably see several thousand people with CP across the center, but only roughly 500 are seen per year in the clinic that documents them in the registry.
Right.
Right. So that's a very big thing. So that speaks to your point. And then the other point that Poonam asked was, since GMFCS can change over time, is that captured as it's changed for individuals? Right.
It's a great point, because, you know, vision can change over time. Someone can have seizures that they didn't have seizures before, any of these things. What I've reported here is generally the last data point that we have. And so if you were level 4 and over time you became level 5, you'd be reported in here as level 5. But we can go back and look and see what has, you know, how have individual GMF changes happened over time. But when we report in the sort of aggregate like this, we use the most recent number.
Yes, and we definitely do have that. We could do a study of GMFCS change over time. Poonam, did you have another question since I see your hand? You're muted.
Sorry. I think it'll be interesting to see how this functionality or ambulation changes in individuals. Because as Jay was growing up, we were told, oh, if he doesn't walk independently till 12, then he's never going to walk independently. So we were kind of given these blanket statements. And I think it'll be interesting for people coming after us to kind of see, what the trend is, if there is a trend.
Mhm.
I think there's actually a study being planned right now to look, because there is some data about GMFCS decline over time, but I don't think it's necessarily followed long enough, especially when we've discovered there's an issue of functional decline with adults. And so I think there's some interest in a study in that area in particular. I just heard somebody mention in the last 24 hours. So
thank you.
GMFCS over, Dr. Hurwitz is commenting, GMFCS over time correlated with history of interventions. I don't know if that's a statement or a clarification.
Just
I think
saying
it's a
that.
study idea.
Just saying that'd be interesting. Something we really need to look at.
Yes, and we have a lot of data. We will have a lot of data on that. There was a question from Chris Myers about whether or not there are some doctors would be a good primary care physician that have decent knowledge of cerebral palsy. I'm sure this is something that you deal with as an internist a fair amount.
The short answer is you're unlikely to find an internist or a family physician who's knows a lot about CP unless they have a sibling with CP or have some sort of personal connection to CP. What you may well find is a good primary care physician who is comfortable with people with functional challenges, who may so it may not be CP specifically, but they may end up having a number of patients with multiple sclerosis or spinal cord injury or some other thing where they have gotten good at working on function, and they have gotten good at working on sort of the medical problems that go along with having a motor functional disability. Breathing troubles, swallowing problems, urinary problems, and that kind of thing. But, the average, my colleagues who did internal medicine residency, they took care of people who had strokes and spinal cord injury and so on. But the bread and butter of their day is high blood pressure and diabetes and back pain and respiratory infections and that kind of thing. And those are all things that people with CP get also. And so the interesting thing then is, just what do they have sort of the cognitive flexibility and the cognitive interest to learn more about CP and learn more about diabetes in the context of somebody with CP. And Dr. Hurwitz and his group have done a ton of work on this, that, it's a big problem and it's out there for people with CP. So I in general, my advice is don't hold out to find a primary care doctor who is a CP expert. Find a primary care doctor who is a curious person, a good communicator, and willing to learn.
The other thing that I would add to that is that there is work going on in the network that Dr. Hurwitz and I are very involved with, and looking at how telemedicine could be used to sort of augment the ability of a person with CP or a provider that's a PCP without expertise to connect with someone who is an expert in adult care of people with CP. And so we're exploring ways in which that could cover a very broad swath of the United States as a solution. So we've reached the end of the hour. I don't see any questions in the queue. I'm going to say a very big thank you very much to Dr. Noritz and everybody who attended this evening. Greatly appreciate your time and attention. Thank you.
Good to see you all. Thanks.
Bye.